Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome. Today's campfire conversation is going to take us to the other side of the world, to the country of New Zealand. This is a country that has always carried a lot of mystery for me personally. It consists of two islands about 1,200 miles from Australia, with a landmass about the size of the state of Colorado. Yet when we look at travel images of the country online, we see snow-capped mountains, we see gorgeous lakes and beautiful beaches. New Zealand was one of the last land masses on Earth to be settled by humans. Wikipedia calls it a developed country that ranks highly in international comparisons of national performance, such as quality of life, education, protection of civil liberties, government transparency, and economic freedom. So I admit, in preparation for this talk today, I had to look up which of the 7 continents New Zealand was part of. And it turns out that it's none of them. It is part of a separate submerged continent called Zealandia. And perhaps someday we'll see an 8th continent listed in the school textbooks. But today we're going to talk with my very good friend, Rob Lochman, who I have known for close to 20 years. Rob and I have been on a few of our own adventures together. But back in 2019, right before COVID-19 began to spread, Rob answered a calling to travel to New Zealand by himself. And he's here to tell us that story. Rob, welcome to the campfire.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Yes, sir. So I have to share a funny little story. So we've known each other for 20 years. And the first time we met, you were actually Kenny Rogers.
True story.
True story. We were at a Halloween costume party, and you introduced yourself as Kenny Rogers, and you definitely look the part. So,
yeah.
But we live here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I tell you, let's just jump right in. I wanna hear just a little bit about what life looks like for you here in Charlotte.
Sure. So, as I recall, I think you were Don Ho at that party. Just wanted to put that out there. But so I've lived in Charlotte for just over 20 years at this point. Lived in the same house for, 14 already. Have 3 kids. Work at a major bank and major employer here in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can take your pick of which one of those is. And I work as a product manager. I do, in my free time, I coach my kids' soccer team, play some adult softball as a reason to generally go drink a beer afterwards, and really enjoyed riding bikes and just living the dream here in my little streetcar suburb here in Charlotte, North Carolina. So
living the dream here in Charlotte. But 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, right about now, maybe a couple of months shy, but you had this calling to go to New Zealand, and you jumped on a plane and you went. And most people wouldn't just get on a plane and go halfway across the country by themselves, but halfway across the world by themselves. So for the listeners, tell us, can you just kind of break down that trip for us? What was the, where'd you go? What'd you do?
Sure. So, I think the first thing is I do have to thank my employer for giving me a sabbatical. Been at my employer for a long time. And they instituted a sabbatical program where they were giving people 4 weeks paid sabbatical. You had to take it all at once. There was no choice. You either took it or you didn't. So it was a little bit stringent, but it was kind of like, get out of here and go do something, not this bank, for a while, which is really awesome from an employee standpoint, right? So I think that, but when you have an opportunity like that, especially as an American, we don't have generally that much vacation. At least I did. I felt like I needed to do something somewhat epic, right?
Yeah.
I needed to do something big that wasn't just go, sit on a beach, in South Carolina for a month, right? I wanted to do something kind of splashy and big. And my wife was generous enough to say, no, go do you for 2 weeks, and then we can do, all the Christmas stuff. So I happened to leave right around Thanksgiving. In fact, I spent Thanksgiving in New Zealand, which that's kind of a funny story. Maybe I'll get to that in a minute, but took off from Charlotte, packed it up, and went out on my own for a big trip for the first time since I traveled Europe as a kid. How old was I? 22 maybe when I was in Europe. So for the first time. So it felt a little bit like that. A lot of times I was out kind of just on my own pretty quickly. I will say the jet lag on that long of a flight is real. I got through the customs. I got my little rental van, and everything was good. And then I got a few miles down the road and realized I am really tired, and it's like 3 p.m. or something like this.
How long is that trip? And how many stops do you have to take to get there?
So I stopped just in LAX, and then took off from LAX. And my time in LAX was not but a couple hours or something like that. It wasn't particularly a long time, but I think I almost have to look it up. It's really long. I mean, it's 4 hours out to LA, give or take. And then it's probably another 12, maybe it might even been 14 hours out to New Zealand. I mean, it's out there.
Yeah.
Australia is too, but it's so when you're flying, one of the funniest things that I noticed is the whole night you're just in, if you're used to flying, you ever have the seat back computers or whatever, and you look at the maps and what you're flying over. You're just flying over the blackness of the Pacific for pretty much the entire night, which is wild. You're just out there, man.
Yeah, that's oh man, you're kind of in the middle of nowhere. So then what's the time difference? You're traveling for, I mean, sounds like almost a full day, and then when you get there, what's the time?
So you obviously cross the date line, right? So right now in New Zealand, it's 9:45 a.m.
Okay.
Tomorrow. So, and I basically, when I'm having fun with my buddy Grayson, who's from over there, I'll say, how's tomorrow? Can you predict the future for me?
Yeah.
At least 18 hours or so.
Traveling to the future. Yeah. Yeah. And so you said, when you got there, you got your little travel van. I want to hear about that, because that's part of the trip here.
Yeah. So there's a huge, part of the New Zealand culture is very camp oriented, right? They really do enjoy getting out there and really taking in the country, right? One of the biggest vacation things to do in New Zealand is to actually go get a camper van, maybe a trailer, and go camp. So the cool thing about it from a tourist perspective is there's lots of rental options. And I found one called Mad Campers, which has I think locations in Christchurch and Auckland, and they have just 2 little varieties of trucks. And the one that I ended up getting is kind of this really unique little Honda that's probably, I'd say that they're probably, I don't even remember the name of the model because it's a Japanese model. It was never available here. But it's kind of like a little micro minivan. Mm-hmm. And what they had done is they had taken out all the seats on the passenger side, which, fun fact, for Commonwealth countries is on the opposite side for what we have. So anyway, it was on what we would call the driver's side, but they basically made a seat, basically made a bed out of that whole area. And then you had the driver's seat, and then it's space, and then the original 3rd row seat, or at least half of that original 3rd row seat, was in there. And then had a little kitchen in the very back. So if you lifted up the lift gate in the back, there was a little sink, and you could pull out a little burner stove. And there was even a toilet. I didn't actually ever use the cassette toilet, but it was there. So anyway, so it's a big thing there culturally is to camp out. And when I got there, the folks put me onto 2 apps that said, all right, here's basically between these two apps, you're going to be able to find every campground in New Zealand and then some. There's almost there's this one, and I can't remember the name of it, that's almost like an Airbnb sort of situation. It's literally like people let you just pull up in their driveway for the night, or something like that. So culturally, it's really big. It's very well accepted that people are going to go around the country. And I think it's interesting. Like if you think about what's happened here in the States in the last year or the last 18 months, is people have decided, hey, let's go camping, right? Like, I mean, I think whether it's in an RV or whatever, I mean, I'm kind of excited because it feels like people have kind of rediscovered that and started thinking about doing their own trips to, not only the big parks, but just even the stuff around, like locally here in Charlotte, where you've got the Smoky Mountains and you've got the Uwharrie National Forest, and like there's some good camping very close to Charlotte.
We're very lucky. We have a lot of great camping around here.
Yeah. And you just kind of forget about it, right? You get in your day to day and you just kind of forget about it, but it's a big part of their culture. So it's actually really easy to go kind of wherever you want in one of those campers and find a place. So
there's like a lifestyle associated with, and this thing's not really an RV, right? I mean, this is a converted van that's got enough space for one.
Yeah, it was tiny. I mean, it was really little, but the cool thing was about it for me is it was plenty big enough for me. And it wasn't so big and cumbersome. So New Zealand has a lot of really narrow roads, right? Like one of the things if you ever go there as an American, you'll notice right away is that they don't have big 3 and 4 lane highways all over the place, right? Like there's just the idea of what we have. Their roads are just generally narrower and more windy. They're not very straight. There's only a couple of sort of freeway-ish roads in the entire country. So being in a top heavy vehicle, right, that is bigger than I needed was something I really wasn't looking for, right? Like I didn't want to be driving on the wrong side of the road,
right?
On the wrong side of the vehicle with something that was, like Chevy Suburban size, right, and weight,
right.
So or bigger, right? So I think that's part of the reason I like that little setup so well, is because I didn't need any more space. It was just me. And it was, it was a small, at the end of the day, it was a small car. You could take it and put it anywhere, right? Like it was not a pain to park it in any parking lot you ever found. It was always easy to camp with. Like it was just great.
So did you do the sort of Airbnb parking driveway thing, or did you where were you parking at night?
So I did a lot of different things. The other thing that there's a lot of in New Zealand is there's a lot of free camping. So like if you think about the West here in the United States, right? Like if you're on Bureau land out there in the West, you can just kind of pull over and camp anywhere, right? Like there's no real restrictions. It's not quite like that in New Zealand, but there's an awful lot of like parking lots and or parking lots at a state park that happens to have like a toilet there or whatever. There's a lot of free camping if you can find it. And that's why you use those apps, right? Because they'll point it out and they'll say, look, there's free camping here, or, and then there's a lot of places where you can camp and even have like access to showers and a lot of different stuff for, like $25 New Zealand or whatever. So it's, $15 a night or whatever. So, that's how you use those apps, man. That's kind of how I figured it out. But the first day, I actually did do an Airbnb because I was so fried that I couldn't get my brain to work and figure out where I needed to go. And that was fun. But then the rest of the time I was in that camper. So, I just kind of went, man. I mean, I just didn't even have much of agendas, which was kind of awesome.
That's what I love about this. It's just, you just took this trip and there was just freedom to it. It was just like, let's just go. And so, I mean, you're on the other side of the country. You're, learning how to drive on the other side of the road. You're in this van, you're by yourself. I mean, what is it like? Did you experience any like fear or doubt, or like what was going on those first couple of days when you first got there?
So I will say the one thing about obviously New Zealand is that you don't have a language barrier there, right? Like, sure, they might say some things kind of funny and you're going to end up eating a meat pie or two because they're delicious. Either not here, I don't know. But but it's so close, right? Like it's so culturally similar to us that that's easy, right? Like that fear, for me, that fear gets higher when you're in a place where you're not a native speaker, right? Like you're, like if you go to Europe, right? Like most of Europe, yeah, it's similar, but you can't speak the language. You're going to maybe struggle to get around a little bit as a result of that. It's part of the reason I've never been, besides the just overall size, I've never really been to Asia per se. Like I've never been to Japan or China or
Yep.
any of those countries because of sort of that truly is kind of a fear factor for me. Like is not being able to speak those languages.
Yeah.
Is tough as a tourist.
So let's just real quick, like, can you talk about like the terrain that you covered, and were there any highlights about the the kind of the country and sort of the ground that you covered?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, probably the first thing I did, after that Airbnb was I actually went to Hobbiton, which sounds cheesy and touristy and kind of is, right? For most Americans, you're going to have some relation to New Zealand via those movies, right? So the Lord of the Rings movies and the Hobbit movies. There is a permanent, what they used in the Hobbit movies is now a permanent tourist attraction in the hills, kind of in the central area of the North Island. And again, you think it's going to be cheesy and silly, but it's gorgeous. Like it blew me away. You got to, right? Like it's really kind of the gardens. Like it really feels like somebody lives there and it's somebody who's really proud of their garden. Like, and so you do kind of expect to see a hobbit pop out of one of those doors.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to go see Harry Potter at Disneyland, right, you got to go to see the Hobbit in New Zealand too, right?
Yeah. I mean, and this is very different in that it's exactly the sort of pastoral thing that they want you to believe the Shire and the Hobbit is, right? Like they nailed it. It's really hilly. The tour's a little silly, but it's fun. Like it was just, I was shocked at how cool it looked. But at the end of that trip, after there is a beer at the end of it. So if you're into beer,
there's a theme coming here.
Right, yes, it's a little thematic. So just started chatting this gal up, and she said that I should go down to Gisborne. I'm like, well, what's Gisborne? She's like, well, it's kind of this little town out on the East Coast. It's a surfer town. And I was like, okay, sure, let's go do that. Not knowing that it would take me another 6 hours to get down there. I just started driving. I was like, well, let's go to Gisborne. And talk about the fear factor, since I had no idea where I was going really, or where I was going to end up that night. I had a vague idea. Plan was to go and actually get a permit and camp at this one beach. But by the time I got down there, the agency had closed. Like it was like a state park agency or whatever. And it was, by the time I rolled out, it was like 5:30 and they were done for the day. And I was like, uh-oh, now what? But I lucked out and I just went up the road a piece and found one of those free parking spots that actually sits right on a beach. And it was gorgeous. It was just incredible. I was like, how is there not a million people here? And as I looked around, it was really stark from the US, because behind me was just this big rolling hill, really tall, actually. It's more, and there was a sheep on it. I mean, there was no houses, nothing, just sheep.
Beautiful.
And it was beautiful. And there was probably, on one end of the beach that I was at, there was probably, a dozen houses at that far end. And then there's probably a dozen spots in that, in that little parking spot. And it was mostly surfers and me. So it was awesome.
Was there any concern of like, going to sleep, I'm in this van, like any safety concern?
So that was my first night in that van. And I think, it's something to where you kind of wind yourself up. The cool thing was it had full blackout curtains. So you buttoned up these curtains into the windshield and all around the thing. So it's fully private, but yeah, I mean, you never know. I mean, it is, I think Americans might be a little bit more paranoid than your average bear around doing stuff like this. just parking in a parking lot. I think it goes back to that culture, right, that New Zealand has about camping, and they're not going to mess with you, and there's no reason to. So, but yeah.
So something tells me that, knowing you, that you went out to New Zealand by yourself, but you weren't void of people interaction. What was that about? Like, what? Tell me about some of the people that you met, or.
Well, part of the impetus to go was I have a very good friend actually, I've known him a little bit longer than you, believe it or not. His name's Grayson Bainbridge. He married my first roommate here in Charlotte, believe it or not. Jennifer and I shared a condo for a little bit. And in fact, she went to New Zealand and met him right after I had lived with her. So they had moved back a few years ago. They had always intended to move back, and they just hit a point where they're like, well, we need to kind of go now or it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
As the kids grow up, and I think they really did kind of want their kids to grow up a little bit in New Zealand. So the idea was basically to go visit them as part of the trip. And so that's what I did. I actually went from Gisborne over to their place the next day, and then we had Thanksgiving dinner with them, which was really funny.
Cool.
And Grayson has clearly adopted Thanksgiving as a thing because he loved it here in the States and went to a lot.
Thanksgiving in New Zealand.
It's well. So get this. So it's a real struggle for him because he wants to do a turkey, he wants to do all the standard stuff, and not only obviously does New Zealand have a different culture and different food culture, but they do all that stuff at Christmas. So getting a turkey that early is a little bit of a feat, because you're a month out from Christmas. So he told me all about that. He's like, yeah, I do this every year, but I really have to I really hunt for the turkey because it's not easy to find.
That's funny.
But yeah, so I've known those guys for 20 years and got a chance to see them again. I mean, they lived here in North Carolina for a long time, but went to their kids' cricket game, which was fun, right? I actually started to feel like I knew something about cricket after a minute. So that was good. And yeah, I mean, we just went to a winery because they live in Hawke's Bay area, which is kind of the wine country of the North Island. Now, obviously, most people are going to know the Marlborough region, which is the northern part of the South Island, because that's not confusing. But yeah, so it was a lot of fun. We went to climbed up this mountain. I can't remember the name of it. But it was really cool. It was fun to get kind of that local, and I really dig that. My adventures in Spain have been marked by hanging out with a local friend that I have from there. So it's fun to have that local perspective anytime you get to go somewhere.
Yeah. The people interaction obviously is part of the trip while you're there, but then there's also a good amount of time that you're in this van by yourself. What's going on in your head as you're driving? You're spending all that time alone.
I mean, I just listen to music. It's funny, because I don't drive that much on the regular. The idea of a road trip is pretty infrequent for me these days. I don't have a long commute by design. Even prior to pandemic, where my commute went from my bedroom to my office. But even before that, my commute's 10 minutes to uptown. So it's kind of nice to just zone out, right? And just let your mind wander and either think about nothing or think about whatever you want, right? And I think that's part of the cool thing about the sabbatical idea, right? If sometimes you don't, these days, folks don't even get away from work when they do go on vacation, right? They're worried about work or they're thinking about work the whole time. But man, 4 weeks is a long time, and eventually it just turns off. You just do finally stop thinking about it, which is glorious.
It's fabulous. I mean, I love that you said you just zoned out and just think about nothing. I mean, we live in a place here in our city where it's just, going, doing. And, I love this concept of just zoning out and doing nothing.
Yeah. It's fun to just kind of be from time to time, right? Just kind of be in the space and take it up
from time to time. There you go.
Yeah.
So I guess that takes me to I want to talk about the like that call to go, because you have, you've got 4 weeks and you said, I want to do something epic, I want to do something splashy, but again, like most people aren't going to just get on a plane and go like by themselves all the way across the country, like or across the, did said it again, across the world. So what was it that called you to New Zealand?
So I think it was curiosity, right? I mean, and it's those people connections, like you said, right? Like my connection to Grace and my connection to Jennifer, who both, obviously love the country. It's what I would call a low barrier to entry travel place for Americans, because everybody speaks English and the culture is so close that it's not literally like the biggest deal is driving on the wrong side of the road. And it was just really just kind of planning it out, right? Like deciding when was the optimal time to go. And for my work, we get into the second half of fourth quarter and it really slows down. Like there's just not, people kind of give up on the year and start putting stuff off until the next year for a great degree. So I think it was that, and it was really sitting down with my spouse and figuring out, what's the optimal time to go? When is it going to be least cumbersome for you? Right. So obviously the holidays, you don't have to get kids to and fro to practice or to school, right? Like you've got days off of school. So the daily grind is a little different when you're in holiday mode, which is obviously also a good thing. But that made that timing work out. And then from that point, I had it in my head that I wanted to go do the camping thing. I'm not even sure, honestly, not even sure where that idea came from. I just thought this will be great and went and researched it online. Found the place, found the Mad Campers place, decided that was what I was going to go with. Booked a plane ticket, booked the vehicle. And then I didn't even, like the ferry crossing stuff, I didn't even book until I got there. So when I went across the South Island, I booked it like the day of or whatever, day before maybe.
Well, you said curiosity, and I love that word. Like, what do you feel like? What do you think you were curious about?
I mean, it's curious about a different way of life, right? Like, I mean, as close as they are to us, they're still quite different. It's funny. Like I've been joking this summer that I've been working on my Hobbit feet because I've just been going around in bare feet and maybe flip flops all summer, like because I don't have to go to work, right? I don't have to actually physically show up and wear, hard shoes, which is lovely. So, but over there, right? Like the idea of no shirt, no shoes, no service just doesn't exist, right? Like there's enough of this laid back, and maybe some of it comes from some of the Maori heritage, like spilling over into the main culture. But like we went with Grace and we went to what they call a dairy, which is really kind of a little convenience store. And we went and got some ice cream and some what they would call lollies, which is candy. And we walked in our bare feet because we can, and nobody cared. And it was like the biggest non-event at all. But for me, it was so foreign. That was so foreign. So I think, New Zealand is a lot more of a laid back situation. They have a saying that is, she'll be right, which means it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Right. Like, and that they use it for everything, whether it's like, and it actually frustrates my friend Jennifer quite a bit because like construction projects, they'll be like, it's close enough. Right. Like they aren't really going for perfection most of the time, which is really kind of refreshing. But I could see how Jennifer growing up here would be pretty frustrated with that as well.
What's the phrase again?
She'll be right.
She'll be right. She'll be right.
She'll be right.
We'll use that one.
I can't do a Kiwi accent.
So in the curiosity, you said a different way of life. So that was, So, is it kind of a draw to like, just go see what else is out there? Is there something, maybe that you were looking for that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that's what you do. That's part of why I do travel. I mean, I don't know if other people are looking for the same thing, but I think it's a comparison, right? Like being being a world citizen, you have to recognize that the way we do things isn't the only way to do things, right? And again, like, as close as New Zealand is, it's not the same, right? Like, I mean, shoot, you could go to Canada and it'd be the same thing, right? There's going to be slight variations on how they do things versus how we do things. You go to Europe and it's not like there's a lack of cars, but there's a whole lot more bikes. Like if you go to Amsterdam or wherever, it's just there's different ways to be in the world, right? And I think that's what the adventure is, right? Like, just go try on. It's like trying on a new way of life to a little bit of a degree, right? Like, you just get, especially in a situation like I had where it was a little bit longer, I had a little bit more time. And I like getting out there. I like being sort of inside normal life. Like, I like going to, even when I'm traveling in the United States, I'd rather go to a city most of the time than I would rather go to some resort. I'm just not a resort person. And maybe that's just my personality. My idea of being in the world, as I described it earlier, isn't like sitting on a chair next to the pool with an umbrella drink in my hand, just waiting.
It's a little harder to be curious, right? It's a little harder to be
Yeah.
curious in that environment. You go to a big city, there's lots of things that you can do to satisfy your curiosity. But I just have to say, the thing I really loved that you said is, our way is not the only way.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
And that's huge. That's a huge piece to what I think travel is all about. And I think you summed it up really well right there. I think that's pretty cool. One of the things I wanted to talk about was just sort of some of the barriers to keeping you from going on the trip. And you started to talk about that a little bit, but like, was there anything, like, did you have any doubts? Was there any point at which you were kind of like, nah, this sounds like this would be fun, but I don't know if I can do this, or, did you have any resistance to pulling the trigger?
I think probably the only resistance was it felt selfish, right? Like, and I think, as a dad, as a regular guy, it feels selfish, but you know what? Sometimes everybody needs that. Everybody needs that break to be yourself again for a minute, not be dad, but be Rob, right? Like, and just do exactly what you want to do. And, my spouse and I have a good relationship that way. I think we try to keep a balance in that regard. She'll go do a girls' weekend or do whatever like that from time to time. So anything as big and grand as this. But again, she doesn't have the sabbatical program and she's a working mom. So it's a little bit different for her. But I do think that was probably the main thing. Selfishness in the time, selfishness in the money that was going to get spent. I mean, it was literally just spending it all on me and nobody else, right? And Christmas is coming up or whatever, right? Like, not that my kids suffered that Christmas for anything as I can recall.
I mean, I think I think a lot of people can relate to that selfishness piece. And I think a lot of people might choose not to go for that reason. But like, I agree with you. Sometimes you do have to do the thing that you need to do to experience your own adventure and answer that call. Like, can you help, like, people that are listening? How do you get over that selfishness piece?
I mean, I got over it because my spouse was so supportive of it, right? Like, there was never any doubt. There was never any ambiguity around, like, would I have some penance when I got back, right? Like, would I have this ludicrous honeydew list that would last, all the way till now or longer, right? So, I mean, I think it for me, it's that give and take that we have, and maybe not everybody has that. But I mean, it's hard. I mean, there's no easy way about it. If you're feeling selfish feelings, they're probably right? Like, but at the same time, you just have to balance that out with how much you're giving to everything else, right? Mm-hmm. Like, not your family, how much you're giving to your kids, how much you do give to your spouse on a regular basis, for goodness sakes, how much you give to your job, right? Like, I mean, take a little bit back for yourself. I mean, you only get one shot at doing this, and putting it off or being a martyr isn't going to do you any good either.
Yeah, I think you just inspired a lot of people with what you just said, Rob. That's awesome. Great stuff. So when you got back from the trip, so you obviously had to fly back another day to get back. And after you got over the jet lag, How did this trip change you? It's been 2 years. I think I want to ask that in two parts. Like, how did it change you when you first got back? And, how have you been changed over the last 2 years, or did you just sort of go back to the same old?
So I think the biggest thing is I recognize that I want to travel with my kids as well, right? Like I want to take them out. I want to expose them to something besides the four, especially now with COVID, right? The four walls that they grew up in, and the community in which they're in, and show them, exactly what I described earlier, that there's different ways of going about life, and that the one we have been raised in or chosen or chose us, isn't the only thing that exists. So, broadening them culturally, preferably kind of before they're in their 20s or whatever, like I did, right? Like I was pretty much a proto adult by the time I actually got out there and started doing things. I think that's the number one thing when I came back that I was dwelling on, right? Like, okay, so how do I do this with my kids? I think second of all, right, like it's those things that we've seen in such stark relief over the last year. Like, I think, you've seen what Jacinda's done in New Zealand and how they've kind of all pulled together, and you watch that from afar and you're like, man, that would be great to have here in the US. Why can't we rally around one thing anymore, right? Like we just, between our media influence, the social media, whatever, right? Like I think that, I'm not saying our society is coming apart at the seams, but I mean, we should be able to have a polite conversation with an old friend without it being, a huge knockdown, drag out political debate that everybody goes to their corners and nobody comes out. So I think that's the one thing that really, as I look back and I really kind of weigh how New Zealand in particular was basically able to crush COVID, had very few problems with it. Everybody kind of got on board. And we sat here and bickered and fight, and now, over 600,000 people are dead that probably didn't need to be, right? Like they're not going to make it to this Christmas. They're not going to get to go to New Zealand, right? They're not going to get to have their next adventure. Because we struggle. I think maybe the individuality in this country has gone a bit far afield, right? Like, could you imagine? Like, it's almost hard to imagine even, we're like at the 20-year anniversary within a couple of days here of 9/11.
Right.
That's the last time I felt like a real unity in this country. Like I feel since then it's just crumbled, and it's hard to imagine being unified to go fight World War II, for goodness sakes, or World War I, or any of that at this point. So, as you look back, there's a whole lot to digest out there in the news world right now, right? Like the Afghanistan coming to an end, and 9/11 being at its 20-year anniversary here in just a few days. There was a point in time where we all were kind of in agreement, right or wrong, on the outcome and what we did, but at least we were all Americans, right? And it feels like there's like this contest of how American you are anymore, and depending on what, are you a red American or are you blue American? It's frustrating.
I loved the comment about unity, and I guess I'm curious, when you were there in New Zealand, did you feel that sense of unity when you were there?
I didn't really feel it, but everybody just kind of got along. It felt like, right? Like it was like it feels like we don't like even driving these days, right? Like it feels like everybody feels slighted. Everybody's in too big of a hurry. People are running red lights like crazy of late. I don't know what's going on with that. It's me first all the time here in the last couple of years. To me, like that's my observation, and there it just wasn't. It was like, she'll be right. Right. It was like,
I was just going to say that you nailed it. That's what we need. We just need a little more. She'll be right. She'll be right.
I think that's exactly it. I think just be a little bit more patient, be a little bit more in the moment, take your shoes off, walk around, and
show your hobbit feet.
And show your hobbit feet, build your hobbit feet up.
It's all good. I love this. Rob, this has been awesome. I got a couple of fun questions. And then we'll wrap up here. But you took this epic trip, and someday they're going to make a movie about it. And I want to know who's going to play you.
Oh, so I suppose I'd probably have to have Matt Damon play me.
Matt Damon. Okay.
I've been told by people that I look like a fat, boring Matt Damon. So, and I did live in Boston for a minute. So,
okay. All right. Can you do the Boston accent? Can you pull that out?
I can't do much of a Boston accent.
Right.
It's not very good anymore.
All right. Very good. Matt Damon. And what's your movie going to be called?
I want to say Get Out, but that's already taken. Also a good movie if you haven't seen it. Nice thriller. Probably Get Out There. Get Out There.
How about She'll Be Right?
She'll Be Right would be a good one too.
Is there a movie called She'll Be Right?
I think there's one called She's All That, but it's been a minute since I saw that one.
There you go. Man, thank you. Thank you so much for the time. If people have questions about New Zealand or, what it takes to do a trip like this or anything about what we talked about today, what would be the best way for them to get a hold of you? They can reach out to me and I can get them in touch with you.
Yeah, as well. I think that's probably the best way. I mean, great. I would say find me on Twitter, but you're not going to find me on Twitter. I'm hidden on Twitter.
If you want to hear from Rob, if you have questions for Rob, send me an email and I'll get you all in touch. I hope that you have been inspired today as much as I have. Hope that Rob's story has encouraged you to listen to that voice inside that calls you to go on your adventure, because we want to hear your story next. So if you have a story to tell or you need a nudge, please send me an email. And until next time, go get outside. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Scott.